This is week 2, part 2, before my 15-minute time limit expired. We are talking about this quote from your text and then this quote from the IRA standards, which talk about how your assessment choices make very powerful controlling statements. And I gave the example of someone who pushes fluency maybe over comprehension and the implications that might have on the student. I know in the IRA standards they actually talk about, for example, if you're preferencing one kind of writing over another and constantly doing narrative writing versus expository, the implications that may have on the student. So let's move forward and talk about what is assessment. That was the big question, essential question, if you will, last week. I've gotten some good answers from you all on the discussion forum. Stephanie mentioned that assessment is a measure of student learning and progress throughout the school year and is used to guide and improve instruction. And I think that's very much in agreement with the IRA standards. I think they would support that perspective of assessments. Kimberly brought up that an academic assessment should focus on language. I think that was also prevalent in IRA standards. They were talking about the language of assessment and the importance of language in assessment and how that might be a determining factor for a lot of students and create some bias against other groups of students. You guys also brought up the point that with Common Core and Smarter Balance, there is supposed to be a shift to more listening and speaking and discussion and actually incorporating more language into assessment and getting away from multiple choice. So I'm glad you picked up on that key shift. Jennifer talked about how assessment is our best attempt to measure a student's learning progress. And I haven't talked to Jennifer to see exactly what she meant by that, but I kind of thought there were many interpretations to that statement, which is why I pulled it from the discussion. But just the idea of it is our best attempt. We really are trying to put the student first and get the most purposeful information from the assessment and create a valid measure and a reliable measure to have a better understanding of the student's learning progress, which can be hard to do. It can be hard to get at the root of their understanding and why they think the way they do in a quick assessment. All right, and a longer quote from Erin, who said, assessments are educational tools that teachers can use to inform and guide instruction in the classroom. Assessments can also be used to gauge student learning and identify areas of strength as well as diagnose areas of weaknesses. And that's exactly what we're doing in this course, is using assessments to determine strengths and needs, create a profile for the student so that way you can plan targeted intervention, which we'll be doing more of in 581. So great discussion there on what is assessment. I think you guys already have a lot of background knowledge on this topic. That discussion forum was essentially my pre-assessment of your knowledge on assessment, and I was really blown away by how much you already know about the topic of assessment, which is great. So let's switch over and talk about those IRA standards. These were new to me when I took the course, and I think they opened up my horizon of what assessment is and the things you should consider when doing assessment. So number one, probably for a good reason, is that the interests of the student are paramount and that assessments must serve, not harm, each student. This is going to be extremely relevant when you begin to work with a student and you are planning assessment sessions. Please don't harm your student more emotionally or psychologically in how you are planning those sessions. Don't try to give them back-to-back assessments and give them a grueling testing environment. That will probably frustrate them and lead to negative attitudes about reading. So first and foremost, we always want to consider the student. Second, the teacher is the most important agent, and I think that word agent is very intentionally used. You are the one acting on the student. So thinking about your role as teacher and the consequences and responsibilities that accompany that role, thinking about the decisions you are making and the bigger implications for those. We kind of talked about that already. Number 3, the primary purpose is to improve teaching and learning. A lot of you highlighted that statement in your post. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. It's not to catch schools that are doing a bad job, but it's to improve teaching and learning. Number 4, assessment allows for critical inquiry into curriculum and instruction. I think this is also very important. It is giving you evidence to either support or disprove the fact that your teaching is having a positive impact on the student. So it's helping you to do an inquiry and look critically as to whether or not you are having an impact, whether or not the curriculum has an impact, how you are introducing the curriculum. It helps you investigate all of those things. So it really is a necessary tool to be an effective educator. Number 5, it must reflect the complex nature of reading and writing. So simply doing a CVC decoding assessment of sorts, that's not going to assess the whole process of reading. You need to do more of an informal reading inventory where they are reading something, they are explaining what they're reading, answering some comprehension questions, maybe doing a retell. As much as possible, you want to replicate the authentic practice of reading. All right, more standards. Number 6, must be fair and equitable. We don't want to have any bias in our assessments, which has definitely been done in the past with a lot of high stakes testing. All right, number 7, consequences of assessment procedure are considered. So thinking about things like the consequential validity of giving the assessment, what will be the environmental impact of giving the assessment, and hopefully the value in the assessment outweighs the consequences. Number 8, assessment should involve multiple perspectives and sources of data, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about formal testing and also screening. You shouldn't be making big decisions about placing someone in intervention or special education just on one source of data. You need to triangulate your data and have many different sources. You should also base your assessment in the local school community. A lot of people discuss the importance of partnering with parents and families and making sure that all parties involved in assessment have a cooperative and committed relationship. That goes with that standard. And then giving all stakeholders a voice as well. A lot of times it might just be the policymaker making the choice of assessment or the administration at the building making the decision. So the more ownership the various participants feel in the assessment process, the more seriously they value their own and other stake in the process, and the greater the possibility of quality assessment. And a couple of you discussed the fact that when parents know more about the assessment process and understand it better, they're more likely to help their student be successful with that process. 11, families must be involved. They must understand their children's progress. The more they can contribute to that progress, very similarly to what I was just saying. All right, so those are the IRA standards, which you all seem to do a good job of digesting and using to further refine your idea of assessment. The other reading you had to do from last week was that Paris et al. Article from the reading teacher. I had considered taking it out of the course this semester, but it seemed like you got a lot out of it in the discussion forum. I don't know if that's the case, but would love you to share your feedback with me. Maybe just a quick little email, if you you think I should keep it in or get rid of it, if you found it helpful, just so, whatever. I would appreciate that feedback because I'm still not sure if it's the best article to put there in week 1, but it does have some good background information. And they open by saying assessment is fundamental to the improvement of education. And I definitely believe wholeheartedly with that. And they outline a system, pretty much a system for creating your assessments. Essentially, any assessment starts with first identifying the dimensions of literacy. So what is important for you to assess? What are you going to assess? What are you going to teach? What dimensions are you looking at? Then number 2, within each of those dimensions, identifying specific attributes of the dimension. So in the article, they actually give you some sample dimensions like engagement with text through reading, engagement with text through writing. Then they break those down even further and talk about what dimensions of low engagement would look like versus dimensions of high engagement. So really articulating the attributes of the dimension so that you can create your assessment, because once you identify the attributes, you need to then figure out how am I going to assess that attribute in a valid and authentic way so that you can collect your evidence. Then once you collect your evidence, you need to score your evidence, which sometimes can be easier said than done, and there can be discrepancies between teachers even. I have been reading the book Assignments Matter, and they propose a model in which right after you identify what you're teaching, you make the assessment, and then you take the assessment and you create the rubric or the scoring of the assessment. So I think it's important as you're creating your assessment, thinking about what it would look like for how a student would respond to that assessment and what a model or sample paper might look like. So you have the scoring criteria in mind during the instruction part of that. But anyway, so 3 is collecting the evidence, 4 is scoring the evidence, and then 5 is interpreting and using the data as part of that inquiry process, hopefully to improve teaching and learning and to improve your delivery of instruction, your delivery of the content and the curriculum. So that is their framework for authentic literacy assessment. Please let me know what you thought about that article. All right, this week's readings, we have chapter 10, which is formal assessment. I have a very formal looking gentleman over there. This is kind of a meaty chapter, so I said just kind of, skim through it. People are pretty familiar with formal assessment since most schools are required to give one type of formal assessment. So what do you already know about formal assessments? Think about that for a second. Maybe you have some examples of formal assessments that you give at your school. Can you think of any of those examples? The most popular one, if you're in California, is probably the California Standards Test, or the CST, sometimes called the STAR test. That's the California State Test, essentially. Another one, if you have a high population of English learners, would be some standardized or formal English language development tests. So California has the CELT, California English Language Development Test. Those were the 2 that came to my mind, but in chapter 10 they have a ton more of assessments that you can peruse. But what are formal assessments? Typically, they are published tests that provide standardized methods of administration, scoring, and interpretation. So there are standard conditions under which people take the test, under which the tests are scored, so that there is consistency across the board and there is validity and reliability when you're comparing performance of students. So I'm running low on my time, so I'm going to stop there and upload this, and we'll continue talking about formal assessment and how it may or may not be used for screening in RTI.